Our scripture text comes from the prophet Isaiah. I was kind of laughing a little bit as Denise was talking to the kids and asking questions. It made me think of a children's sermon once where I asked the kids in a children's sermon if they knew what a prophet was. And they said, it's when you make a bunch of money. So sometimes you have to be careful with your language and where your language goes. But we are learning about the prophet in the Bible, Isaiah, in chapter 65 and the final verses of that 65th chapter. For I'm about to create new heavens and a new earth. The former things shall not be remembered or come to mind, but be glad and rejoice forever in what I am creating. For I'm about to create Jerusalem as a joy, and its people as a delight. I will rejoice in Jerusalem and delight in my people. No more shall the sound of weeping be heard in it, or the cry of distress. No more shall there be in it an infant that lives but a few days, or an old person who does not live out a lifetime. For one who dies at 100 years will be considered a youth, and one who falls short of 100 will be considered accursed. They shall build houses and inhabit them. They shall plant vineyards and eat their fruit. They shall not build and another inhabit. They shall not plant and another eat. For like the days of a tree shall the days of my people be, and my chosen shall long enjoy the work of their hands. They shall not labor in vain or bear children for calamity. For they shall be offspring blessed by the Lord, and their descendants as well. Before they call, I will answer. While they are yet speaking, I will hear. The wolf and the lamb shall feed together. The lion shall eat straw like the ox. But the serpent, its food shall be dust. They shall not hurt or destroy on all my holy mountain. Let us pray together. Loving one, for the words of my mouth and meditations of all our hearts be pleasing to you, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Now, some might call me a product of the Lego generation. I loved Legos as a kid. My parents would buy me these packs, and they just had all kinds of colors and shapes of Legos, and man, my creativity went wild. I would create buildings and structures and people and situations with all these Legos. It was just a great tool or toy to have in the house. And then the Lego company kind of got smart and went from just having just boxes of generic different size Legos to particular Lego kits that made particular Lego items based on the picture on the box. And there is Lego mania. If you've not gone down the aisle of Target or one other store that has Lego products, there are themed Lego sections in the Lego aisle. There is the Star Wars section, and there's the Harry Potter section, and there's the Lord of the Rings section, and there's Lego themes for everything you would imagine. You can buy the theme that best excites your child. And we bought lots of Legos for our son Walker. Our son Walker loves Legos, and my wife's fear was when we bought Walker Lego kits that Walker wouldn't ever get to put the Lego kits together because I was going to be the one putting them together rather than him. We eventually had to buy little organizing containers for the Legos that we had. It wasn't just that we had a few Lego kits. There were lots of Legos in our house. And we have bins that have a drawer for the white Legos and the green Legos. And I mean, Joni might like the organizational piece of that. I mean, this organizational quality of all these Legos. And when you put the initial kits together, it's kind of exciting. You kind of got this X-Wing fighter or the Millennium Falcon or Hogwarts or whatever it is you've put together, and it's kind of cool to put it together. And then once it's done, it's kind of like, okay, it's finished. I can look at it, but I can't really do much with it once it's finished. And then somewhere along the way, the Lego structures kind of just get crumbled and fall apart. Someone comes in and busts them, knocks them over, and it becomes this giant pile of Legos. And somewhere the manuals of how you put the Lego kits gets lost somewhere. And we don't remember where this Lego went to go on top of this Lego to create the original structure that we had. And then once you have all this pile of new Legos, it's kind of reminding me back when I got my Lego kits to start with, of like, just be creative. Don't worry about the instruction manual. Don't worry about the picture on the box. Just let your mind and your heart and the Legos go wild. And then you'd see Walker do all kinds of cool things with his Legos, things that wasn't on any box, wasn't in any manual, but it was far more creative than any kit could have ever been. Maybe we're all part of the Lego generation, whether we want to admit it or not. We all kind of have a plan to start with of this kit that works out. If you just go to church, and this is how church works, right? You show up, walk in the door, and there's worship, and there's hospitality, and there's ministries, and there's activities, and there's a certain way we do things in every congregation. And then we had COVID-19, and that kind of threw out the manual for how you do church. And all of a sudden you have to say, well, we have all these Legos, we have all these values, we have all these things, and what worked before may not work anymore. And so we put on that creativity hat of church, and we try to figure out what church looks like going forward in this new and unusual age. But the interesting thing is as we try to just figure out church, the world around us is swirling with challenges and opportunities. I wonder, back in this period where Isaiah is writing and prophesying, this imagination of communicating to people that are returning from exile, what the world might be like when they get back from exile. And as much as it might be about a building in their minds of getting back to Jerusalem to help reform the temple again, I would dare say that Isaiah was less concerned about the temple and more concerned about the hearts of the people when they returned. Doesn't lessen the value of space and sacred places and things that define us in terms of physical things that we see and touch and experience. But there's something within the deep recesses of ourselves that needs some rebuilding and some reclaiming for ourselves. It's a challenging thing to kind of think through a new future for yourself. There's an author, Moses Sandoval, who is a Hispanic Latinx author. He wrote a book many years ago entitled On the Move, and the book is a history of the Hispanic church in the United States. And he talks about the complexities of the Hispanic church in our country over the last several generations. He talks about in his book the Cuban Exodus, those that fled Cuba to come to the U.S. He talked about the Puerto Rican migration of those come from Puerto Rico to the United States. He talked about the Mexican migration of those in Mexico making their way to the United States. He talked about the refugee movement out of Central America and South America, and this influx into our country and how it shaped not only the church, but uniquely the Hispanic church, predominantly a Spanish-speaking people in a predominantly English-speaking world, trying to navigate that world in a significant way. And he says there is such complexity in terms of we can think about movements of people, but within every Hispanic church, there is a unique character or quality to that church. He said if you have a church that's mixed with Puerto Ricans and Mexicans and Costa Ricans and those from South America, that church has a hard time navigating itself because the cultures which they've come from are so different. And yet, white Americans don't look at the complexities and nuances of the Hispanic church. Well, they're all Hispanic, right? Yes, but they're all uniquely different from the places they come, and the dialects of their language are a little bit different. And so you go into one Hispanic church, it's very different than another Hispanic church based on the origins of where that group of people has come from. It's interesting in his book, in the very last paragraph of his book, he said, the future of the Hispanic church lies not in its structure, but in the character of its people. It's not what it looks like on the outside, it's what it looks like on the inside. And the same is true for us at church. Yes, we have a beautiful place to look at on the outside, a significant place that calls us and draws us into this place. But there's all kinds of stuff going on inside of us that is morphing and changing, and we can't do it without the context in which we live. There's a group of authors that have written a book entitled Another Way. Some people might think of it as a strategic planning book or a visioning book or how to think through your church life book. And these three authors talk about a different way of imagining what church can be like. And they use a simple acronym of a word that's very common to us. They use the word care. And each letter, of course, means something else. The first letter, C, means creating hospitable space. A means asking self-awakening questions. R is reflecting theologically together. And E is enacting the next action that's possible. As I thought about that process, there's all kinds of strategic things that we do. If we do this, this will be the outcome. The idea of creating a hospitable space, examining yourself, reflecting together, and then acting and not just living in the theoretical world. The church must do this in a context that is challenging around us. We can't just think about theological things in terms of just church structure. We are influenced by so many things in our culture today. It was just fascinating alone, just this week, this church's efforts to respond to Afghan refugees. We got a surprising call from a news station on Monday saying they wanted to do a story about our church helping out Afghan refugees. Went on news at 6 and 10 on Monday night, and little did we know the kind of phone calls that would come on Tuesday. Denise and Debbie and I took many calls on Tuesday and emails that came in. Before Debbie even came in, there was a woman that had sent an email to the church saying, I've got a queen bed, a dining set, household items, kitchen things. Where do I bring them? How can I help? Before we even got the day started, that was sitting in our inbox at the church. And it seemed like every 10 minutes the phone would ring and we knew exactly what that phone call was going to be about. I got an email on Wednesday from a gentleman in our community that says, I speak 4 or 5 different versions of the Afghani language. I'd be willing to help translate if there are translation needs. Had a guy reach out to me this week saying, I have an Airbnb. I'm willing to give it at cost until permanent housing can be placed for these families. I'm willing to help in whatever way I can. I mean, the offerings within our wider community were amazing as we, our own community, responding to this issue. The idea of refugees coming, how hard it is to come to a new culture with a different language, a different way of behaving and living in the world and feeling alone and isolated, coming from places of fear and hardship and difficulty. When we think about church, we think about care, of creating hospitable spaces and asking questions and reflecting theologically and acting in the world. We can't do so without our refugee friends being a part of our discernment and our dialogue. I thought about racial justice, work we've been doing around racial justice for the last 15 months intentionally, that we can't act as a church unless there is a mindset of how do we think and behave with people of different skin colors than ourselves in a church that's predominantly white-skinned? What does it mean to create a hospitable space so when whoever walks through the door It's a place of welcome and inclusion and grace and conversation. And this week I've thought about women in particular, the reproductive rights of women. And we can't have conversations in the church unless we think about our female friends in this church and in our country that struggle with their bodies and the rights of their own bodies and how important that is for their livelihood and the living out of their faith. As we've talked about refugees, at the same time we can not forget our military friends that have been in places of angst and turmoil, and how we respond to those that are trying to provide some sense of peace and governance around the world. I think of our LGBTQ friends, a place of welcome, a place where when someone comes of a different orientation than what's considered the norm, or a different gender identification, that when they walk through the door, they are just people. They're not something other, not something different. They're part of God's creative gifts in the world, and everybody simply just wants to live out their faith, to share life with loved ones of the people they care about the most. I sometimes wonder if the church has done enough dreaming and imagining about church. St. Andrew has done a lot of dreaming and imagining in terms of creating open, welcoming, hospitable places. They've asked hard questions. They've reflected theologically. They've acted on it with justice in the community. And yet our world continues to change. The nuances of issues are complex and wide and are ready for us to reflect on. When we are coming back, and as we are gradually increasing the ability for us to be, quote, back, it's not getting back to normal. We can't ever go back to what was. You can't ever reclaim the past. You can remember the past, you can learn from the past, but you can't be the past. All we can do is be the church in the moment now, and the church that calls us forward. There was a minister who had a member of her church. This member was a female. At a very early age, she had an accident that deformed her face. And she intentionally grew her hair long on the side of her face that had some deformity to it. And over her life had probably 12 different surgeries to help repair the deformities on her face. But she was so concerned about how other people looked at her, she grew hair long and in the front part of her face so people wouldn't see it or see as less of the deformity as possible. My colleague, she said she had a conversation after her 13th face surgery. And she said to her, for all of my life, I've been saying to myself, if I only had a new face, if I only had a new face, if I only had a new face. And she said it was after her 13th surgery that she finally discovered she was requesting the wrong thing in her life. All along, I should have been asking, I need a new heart. I need a new perspective. This may never go away, but the intensity of who I am on the inside, that's what I worry about the most and should worry about the most. If I only had a new heart. as God's people were making their way back from Babylon to Jerusalem. I'm sure they were anxious to get back to temple worship and community life and things that were familiar. But they would soon discover that everything they thought would be the same was really all different. Same location, different reality. I guess it's time that we look on the ground and we see all the Lego pieces kind of scattered all over the place. We might remember, oh, that piece, that went to the Hogwarts set. And this one over here, it went to the land speeder in Star Wars. And this one over here, it built a hospital. But I'm wondering if I took the Hogwarts piece and the Star Wars piece and the hospital piece and kind of put them together, what kind of cool new things might emerge out of that new construction? Yeah, maybe the church is no different. I guess we'll see.